Welcome to True Crime Report. Today, we examine another real crime case that left families, investigators, and communities searching for answers. This story is based on publicly available information, official records, and verified reporting, as we carefully piece together the events that unfolded. Before we begin, if you want to follow more real true crime cases, subscribe to True Crime Report and turn on notifications so you never miss a new investigation. Also, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's begin today's case. A Cleveland firefighter spends his career running into other people's emergencies, pulling strangers out of burning buildings, showing up when nobody else will. He survives all of it. What he does not survive is his own driveway, on an ordinary November evening, carrying a bag of fast food his wife asked him to bring home. The men waiting for him in the dark were not there by accident. They were there because his wife had paid for them to be. And the motive behind it all, a life insurance policy worth $100,000, turned out to be built on a mistake so basic it would have been almost funny if it were not attached to a murder. This is the story of a devoted firefighter who married a woman claiming to be dying of cancer, only to be the one who ended up in the ground. It is a story about a mother who pulled her own teenage daughter into a murder plot, about a chain of young men passing a killing down the line like a job nobody wanted to finish, and about a scheme so poorly built that the person who orchestrated it never even collected the money she killed for. This is the case of Uloma Walker-Curry and Lieutenant William Walker. William Walker spent 15 years with the Cleveland Fire Department, working out of Station 28 and earning a reputation among his fellow firefighters as steady, kind, and completely reliable, the kind of colleague other people wanted on their crew during a bad call. He was 45 years old, previously divorced, and raising children from that earlier marriage. Those who worked alongside him would later describe him as a man defined by service, someone who spent his professional life running toward danger on behalf of strangers, and his personal life quietly taking care of the people close to him. Firefighting, more than most professions, tends to produce a particular kind of trust among the people who do it, built on the understanding that a colleague will not hesitate when it matters. Those who knew Walker described exactly that quality in him, both on the job and off it, a man who tended to give people the benefit of the doubt even when it was not always earned in return. He met Uloma Curry in 2005. She was also divorced, also raising children of her own, a son named Macklin and a daughter named Jackie. The two built a relationship over several years, and by all outward appearances Walker was a patient, generous partner. In the summer of 2012, Curry told him something devastating, that she had been diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer and would not be able to afford the treatment she needed. Walker, described by people who knew him as kind-hearted almost to a fault, proposed marriage on the spot, reasoning that becoming his wife would give her access to his health insurance and a fighting chance at survival. The two married in a private courthouse ceremony. Not long after, they purchased a home together outside the city, in the suburb of Madison, hoping to leave behind the stress of inner-city life for something quieter. William Walker had spent his career running into other people's disasters. He had just built what he believed was an escape from his own. The cancer, according to investigators who unraveled the case years later, was never real. It was, in the words of one investigator who worked the case, a completely fabricated story, constructed specifically to convince Walker to marry her so she could benefit from what she believed would eventually be a payout on his life insurance policy. Underneath the fabricated diagnosis was a much more ordinary and much more dangerous problem, mounting personal debt that had pushed Curry to the edge of financial ruin. Investigators would later determine she had also committed financial fraud using her new husband's identity, and that Walker himself was getting close to discovering it. Two separate pressures, the debt and the fear of exposure, were converging on her at almost exactly the same time. The marriage was still new enough that most people around them still assumed they were newlyweds settling into a fresh start. By the fall of 2013, Curry had decided on a solution. Walker's life insurance policy was worth roughly $100,000, and in her mind, his death solved both problems at once, the debt and the discovery, while also delivering a payout. She did not act alone. Prosecutors would later describe her as the mastermind of the plot, but the actual execution of it ran through a chain of much younger people, several of them teenagers, all of them pulled into the plan by Curry herself. She approached her own 17-year-old daughter and the daughter's 20-year-old boyfriend, Chad Paget, and asked them to help her find someone willing to kill her husband. According to Paget's later account to police, Curry came to him with what he described as a sob story, telling him that Walker was physically and emotionally abusive and was ruining her life, and asking for his help ending it. She reportedly offered him $10,000. Paget did not carry out the killing himself. He brought in his cousin, Christopher Hine, who made a first attempt on Walker's life and failed to complete it. The job then passed to a fourth person, Ryan Doherty, 24 years old, who succeeded where Hine had not. On the evening of November 3, 2013, Curry sent her husband out to pick up fast food for dinner, the same errand that would put him back in his own driveway later that night with a bag of takeout in his hands. While he was gone, she coordinated the ambush by text message with the people waiting for him. Doherty was positioned near the trash cans at the back of the house. When Walker returned home and stepped out of his car, Doherty shot him 4 times. Curry herself called 911, and that call would later become one of the most scrutinized pieces of evidence in the entire case. Rather than answering the dispatcher's direct questions about who had shot her husband or what she had seen, Curry repeatedly said the words "please" and "I love you" to the man dying in her driveway. Cycling through those phrases, instead of providing the kind of specific information a genuinely panicked spouse in that position would typically volunteer. She told police and dispatchers that she had only glimpsed a silhouette of a man standing at the end of the driveway before he vanished, insisting she had no idea who could have done this to her husband. At the time of the shooting, her son Macklin and his girlfriend were inside the home. Investigators arrived to a scene with very little physical evidence to work from, a handful of shell casings near the trash cans, and not much else. In the early stages of the investigation, Curry actively tried to steer detectives toward a different explanation entirely, suggesting the shooting might have been connected to neighborhood drug activity, a narrative police eventually ruled out. For nearly 2 years, the case sat largely unsolved, the physical evidence too thin to build a prosecution on its own. That 2-year gap mattered enormously to Curry's own life during the same period. She continued living in the home she and Walker had bought together, continued receiving the sympathy typically extended to a young widow whose husband had been murdered in a senseless act of violence, and continued raising the same daughter she had recruited into the plot, all while investigators quietly worked a case that had gone cold on paper but never actually closed. The break came in December 2014, when Crime Stoppers and the Cleveland Fire Department jointly offered a cash reward for information. A man named Enrique Ramos came forward, telling police that a friend of his had been approached by Chad Paget with an offer of money to kill someone, and that Paget had specifically identified who he was working for, his girlfriend's own mother. That tip gave investigators the thread they needed. A search warrant for Paget's cell phone records revealed a clear pattern of communication between Paget, Curry's daughter, and Ryan Doherty in the days surrounding the murder. Detectives brought Paget in, and after his own arrest in August 2015, he finally told police what had actually happened, immediately clarifying that he had not pulled the trigger himself, and identifying Uloma Walker-Curry as the person who had set the entire plot in motion. With Paget's cooperation, the full chain became clear, from Curry's initial request to her daughter's involvement to Paget bringing in his cousin, to the job finally landing with Doherty. All four of the people directly involved in carrying out the murder, Paget, Hine, Doherty, and Curry's own daughter, eventually pleaded guilty and agreed to testify against her. Because Curry's daughter had been a minor at the time of the murder, drawn into the plot by her own mother, prosecutors chose not to pursue adult charges against her. She was instead sentenced in juvenile court to 1 month in a detention facility. During proceedings, she described to investigators how surreal the entire plot had felt from inside it, recalling that her mother had reassured her no one would ever believe a woman would hire a group of kids to kill someone, when she personally knew people capable of doing it themselves. A chilling piece of logic that suggested Curry saw her daughter's youth, and the youth of everyone she recruited, as a kind of camouflage rather than a moral boundary. Chad Paget was sentenced to 28 years in prison after pleading guilty to involuntary manslaughter with conspiracy. Christopher Hine received 18 years after pleading guilty to aggravated murder and conspiracy. Ryan Doherty, who fired the fatal shots, received 23 years to life after pleading guilty to aggravated murder. Uloma Walker-Curry's trial began in June 2017 in Cuyahoga County Common Pleas Court and lasted 10 days. She did not take the stand in her own defense. Her legal strategy leaned heavily on the same narrative Paget said she had originally used to recruit him, that her marriage to Walker had been abusive. On the day she had originally surrendered to police, years earlier, she had written a statement claiming she killed her husband because he had abused her. But at trial, her attorneys called no witnesses and presented no corroborating evidence to support that claim, leaving it standing entirely on her own unverified word. Her defense also pointed to inconsistencies in witness testimony and in closing arguments, attempted to shift responsibility for the plot onto her own teenage daughter, suggesting it was the daughter, not Curry, who had actually devised the murder. The strategy did not work. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts, including aggravated murder, conspiracy, and felonious assault. For a case that had taken investigators nearly 2 years to build, and a trial that stretched across 10 full days of testimony, the speed of that deliberation said something on its own, that once the full chain of testimony from her own co-conspirators was laid out in front of them, jurors did not find the case especially close. At sentencing in August 2017, 5 members of William Walker's family addressed the court directly, along with Cleveland Fire Chief Angelo Cavillo and a fellow firefighter from Walker's own station, all of them speaking about his dedication to public service and to the people he loved. Curry remained emotionless throughout the hearing, showing no visible reaction as person after person described the man she had orchestrated the killing of. Cuyahoga County Prosecutor Michael O'Malley did not soften his language when the sentence was handed down, calling her a cold-hearted murderer and saying it was fitting that she would spend the rest of her life behind bars. The court agreed. Uloma Walker-Curry was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In an almost unbelievable final detail, the entire motive behind the killing turned out to be built on a mistake. William Walker had never gotten around to updating the beneficiary listed on his life insurance policy after marrying Curry. It still listed his ex-wife. When the payout was finally processed, it was Walker's ex-wife, not the woman who had orchestrated his murder to collect it, who received the $100,000. Curry had engineered the death of her own husband, pulled her teenage daughter and 3 young men into a killing, and gained absolutely nothing from it. Curry appealed her conviction to Ohio's 8th District Court of Appeals, arguing among other things that a homicide detective should never have been permitted to testify that her 911 call showed what he described as indicators of deception, pointing specifically to her repeated use of the word please and her repeated declarations of love, rather than direct answers to the dispatcher's questions. The appellate court agreed that allowing that particular testimony had technically been an error, but ruled in January 2019 that the mistake was harmless given the overwhelming weight of the remaining evidence against her, and affirmed both her conviction and her sentence in full. Curry pushed the case one step further, asking the Supreme Court of Ohio to take up the matter, but the state's highest court declined jurisdiction in May 2019, closing the door on her direct appeals for good. Technical analysis. From an investigative standpoint, this case is a study in how a killing with almost no physical evidence at the scene can still be built into an airtight prosecution through digital and human evidence gathered patiently over time. The crime scene itself yielded very little, a scattering of shell casings and not much else, which is exactly why the case stalled for nearly 2 years. What ultimately broke it open was not forensic science in the traditional sense, but a combination of a public reward program and cell phone record analysis. The Crime Stoppers tip gave investigators a name to build around, and once they had Chad Pudge's phone records in hand, the communication timeline between Pudge, Curry's daughter, and Ryan Doherty in the days surrounding the murder became the connective tissue that turned scattered leads into a coherent conspiracy. This is a pattern increasingly common in modern homicide investigations, cases that stall on physical evidence alone, but resolve once digital communication records are subpoenaed and mapped against a timeline. Equally important was the prosecution's use of a layered plea agreement structure, securing cooperation from all 4 people directly involved in the murder in exchange for reduced sentences. That strategy meant Curry was ultimately convicted not primarily on physical evidence, but on the consistent, corroborated testimony of the very people she had recruited, a chain of witnesses with every incentive to tell the truth once their own freedom depended on it. There is also a smaller, more human piece of evidence worth pausing on: the 911 call Curry placed in the immediate aftermath of the shooting. Investigators later noted that she used the word please 17 times during that call and repeatedly told the dying man in her driveway that she loved him, rather than answering the dispatcher's direct, repeated questions about who had shot him or what she had actually seen. On its own, that pattern proves nothing. People in genuine shock do not always communicate clearly. But set against everything else the case ultimately proved about her role in the killing, it reads less like panic and more like performance, a call shaped for anyone who might later be listening to it. Psychological analysis. What stands out most about Uloma Walker-Curry is the sheer number of separate lies required to sustain her plan, and how comfortable she appears to have been maintaining several of them simultaneously. She fabricated a terminal cancer diagnosis specifically to manipulate a genuinely kind man into marrying her, an act that required sustained deception over months, not a single impulsive moment. She then recruited her own daughter into a murder plot, reportedly using a manipulative sense of confidence rather than coercion, telling the girl that their scheme was safe precisely because of how implausible it would look from the outside. That detail says something. Important, Curry was not simply hopping to avoid detection. She appears to have been actively reasoning through how her own family's ordinariness could function as a kind of cover. When the crime was finally committed, her behavior in its immediate aftermath, the tearful 911 call, the claim of only seeing a silhouette, the attempt to redirect investigators toward neighborhood drug activity, all reflect a person capable of performing grief and confusion convincingly while already knowing the full truth. Her defense strategy at trial extended that same pattern even further, first invoking an unsubstantiated claim of abuse to explain her husband's death. Then, when that alone did not appear sufficient, attempting to shift blame onto her own teenage daughter in front of a jury. Each layer of this case reveals someone willing to sacrifice the people closest to her, a devoted husband, her own child, in service of a financial outcome that never even materialized. There is also something worth noting in the layered structure of her lies themselves, each one calibrated to a different audience. The fake cancer diagnosis was built for her husband, designed to trigger protective devotion rather than suspicion. The abuse narrative was built for Paget and later for a jury, designed to reframe a calculated financial killing as something closer to self-preservation. The performance on the 911 call was built for investigators and for the historical record of that night, an attempt to establish grief before anyone had reason to question it. Very few people are capable of maintaining three separate, tailored deceptions simultaneously without one collapsing into another, which suggests a level of composure under pressure that likely served her well throughout the 2 years the case went unsolved. The insurance irony. Of every detail in this case, the one that lingers longest is the one Curry could never have anticipated and never managed to fix. She built an elaborate, months-long deception around a fake cancer diagnosis specifically to marry into her husband's insurance benefits. She waited, she planned, she recruited a daughter and 3 young men, and she orchestrated an ambush timed around a fast food run in order to collect on a policy worth $100,000. And through it all, the one piece of paperwork that actually determined where that money would go, the beneficiary form on William Walker's own policy, remained untouched, still carrying the name of a woman Curry had never met. William Walker spent his professional life responding to other people's emergencies, and somehow never got around to a 5-minute administrative task in his own home. And that single oversight meant the entire motive behind his murder produced nothing at all for the person who orchestrated it. There is a particular kind of bitterness in that outcome that goes beyond the ordinary tragedy of the case. Every layer of planning Curry put into the killing, the fake diagnosis to secure the marriage in the first place, the recruitment of her own daughter, the chain of young men brought in one after another until someone finally completed the job, all of it existed in service of a check that was never going to arrive. Even the men she paid to help her never fully collected either, since the promised payments depended on money that was sitting with someone else entirely. Uloma Walker-Curry destroyed a firefighter's life, fractured her own family beyond repair, and sent her daughter into a courtroom and a detention cell, all in pursuit of money that was never hers to collect in the first place. She remains in an Ohio correctional institution today, serving a sentence with no possibility of parole, having gained nothing from the killing except the conviction that put her there. The man who married her to save her from a disease she never had is, in the end, the only person in this story who did exactly what he said he would do. That concludes today's case. If this story left you with questions or thoughts, share them in the comments below. We'd also like to know where you're watching from. If you want more real true crime cases based on verified information, subscribe to True Crime Report and turn on notifications so you never miss a new investigation. Thank you for watching True Crime Report. Stay safe, take care, and we'll see you in the next case.